about family members. I've said some things on other family occasions that made a few people uncomfortable. So I'll try not to say anything controversial or embarrassing today, but sometimes things just happen. In fact, there's a very good chance something that might happen. I want to add a comment to Karen's earlier recognition of Alice Stevens. Alice is one of those folks who was not born a Stevens, but became one through marriage. She changed her name from Alice Hanley to Alice Stevens in 1950 when she married Lauren. We all know that it's always been considered a real privilege and honor for anyone to marry a Stevens. I think we've generally been pretty good catches. I know Alice was always very pleased with her marriage decision, but there's been a few exceptions in the past. At the last family reunion, I thought it would be kind of funny if I asked if anyone had ever married a Stevens and been disappointed in him. To my surprise, quite a number of hands went up. So I'm not going to ask that question this time. We'll just assume that everybody's happy with their partners. We've spent the day reminiscing and telling each other about our lives, our accomplishments, and how great our children and grandchildren have turned out. I've heard many stories of success in careers, in business, in sports, music, and so on. They're all very interesting and we should be proud of them. But we also have to acknowledge that as a family we have a few flaws and shortcomings. Flaws may not be the right word, but what I mean are we have characteristics that are somewhat unusual or a little strange, sometimes just plain goofy. It may seem odd to raise these issues at a family reunion, but I have to talk about them for a few minutes since they're part of our family history. I don't really have to talk about them, but I'm going to. I'm afraid things have not always been as good in some of the Stevens families as it appeared from a distance. To illustrate the point, we only have to look at the Allen Stevens side of the family. Growing up, they always seemed like the Brady Bunch on TV. All well-behaved, nice kids, full of kindness and caring. But behind the scenes, it was often a different story. Some of them acted up in ways that were just shocking to all the rest of us. Although Sandra claimed she was always one of the good ones, but that seems like a bit of a stretch. Emily had her hands full, running the household, trying to keep the kids out of trouble, and assisting Alan with the discipline and punishment. I say assisting because Alan was the one who doled out the actual punishment, but Emily helped set the guidelines and the procedures to be followed. For example, she felt very strongly that kids should not be hit in the head. And this was something she reminded Alan of regularly. Apparently it was okay to smack them around, but just not in the head. I don't think it would be proper for me to say a lot about all the shenanigans that went on in that family, but I'll give you one example. I apologize if some of my details aren't exactly complete, but they're close enough. Many years ago, someone streaked naked through the Harris Boulevard. That's right, they ran right through the bar naked. And there were suspicions that it may have been a Stevens. They were more than suspicions, there was no doubt about it. Initially, there was a lot of speculation about which member of which Stevens family was involved. When it became widely known who the streaker was, local folks started feeling sorry for the parents of the streaker, because they were obviously embarrassed. The parents handled the situation quite well, though. After a week or so, they regained their composure, and Alan and Emily started going out in public again. I hesitate to mention the name of the streaker, but if I don't say who it was, some may think it was Brian, or even one of the girls. And since none of them were involved, at least not this time, it seems to kind of narrow it down to Gary. traveled far and wide. I was living in Saskatoon at the time, and people started asking me if I was related to any of the Stevenses out in Harris. Knowing they were referring to this incident, I started answering, no, I wasn't related. I said I heard of them, but I didn't really know them. And I sometimes said my hometown was in Harris. It was Arda, or Bounty, or Milton, or one of those. I'm not suggesting Alan's kids were the only ones who ever got in trouble and caused problems. I heard a lot of stories about Lawrence and Dick's and Anita's families, except I don't recall any of them being into this running around naked stuff. Things were much different in the less than Jewel side of the family. There were 4 of us boys, Gordon, Dale, Terry, and me. We were pretty straight-laced, and we were free of any scandals and bad behavior. There may have been a few issues and some rumors went around, but there's no need to talk about any of those today. Besides, most of the accusations were nothing but damn lies. It was mentioned earlier today that Gordon and I were right back where we started today. We were both born in Dr. George's offices, which were located above the Rex Variety Store here. We sort of felt at times that there probably would be declared a heritage site, like a memory of my birthplace. But they didn't often do that with prominent people, but it hasn't happened yet. You may have noticed that Gordon and I didn't take part in the scavenger hunt today, and I'll explain why. The words scavenge and scavenger bring back haunting memories for us. We grew up in the Depression of the 1930s, when times were so tough we sometimes had to scavenge just for a bit of food and clothing. We often went to bed hungry and cried ourselves to sleep. I don't know how Gordon feels, but I'm a little miffed that you would laugh at all the hardships we had. Things improved in the 1940s, and Terry's earlier years were in better times. And he's been having even better times recently. He and Linda made so much money farming, they're now retired and living the good life. They winter in the lap of luxury down in California, and they just got back from some fancy river cruise over in Germany. And you won't believe this. They flew first class all the way there and back. That sort of tells you where they sit on the financial and the social scale. Things aren't always fair. Here we have Terry, the youngest of our family, throwing money around like water. And Gordon, the oldest, he's working 7 days a week just to try to make a modest living. I refer to us boys. Well, us boys are kind of getting into us old boys. Our side of it, as was mentioned earlier, our side of the family is considerably older than any of our cousins. Because of our ages and maturity, we always tried to live as role models and set good examples for our others. Most of the cousins looked up to us, and in their earlier years often said they wanted to grow up to be just like us. We really admired them for setting their sights so high. To illustrate how much older we are, Gordon will celebrate his 80th birthday in October, and next year he and Hazel will have been married for 60 years. Many people remember that Dale passed away in 1997. He was a good man and deserved a longer life than he had. We've certainly missed him, and we do even more so on a day like this. Sharon is holiday over in Scotland and couldn't be here. Dean and his family were busy, but we're pleased to have Scott, Chantel, and Sarah here with us today. I want to talk for a minute about politics, but not the Alberta election. Enough has been said about all those conservative rednecks turning into NDP socialists. Granddad Stevens was interested in politics and was very proud when Alan became a politician in the family. Most people know that Alan was an MLA, but the full story of exactly how that came about isn't as well known. In 1959, the CCF party was looking for a new candidate to replace their retiring MLA in the Rosetown constituency. Some of the party executives were trying to recruit a fellow by the name of Wes Robbins. Wes was a well-known person in the political circles, but he would have been a parachuted candidate because he didn't live in the riding. Others felt that some local person should at least run against him so he wouldn't be selected by acclamation. My mom and dad were at that nominating meeting, and they told of how Robbins, in his speech, displayed his knowledge and experience by reciting endless facts, numbers, and statistics. Alan, on the other hand, gave a very short but effective speech, saying he would just do the best he could to represent the riding. The vote was called, the ballots were counted, and Alan won. Dad always said that Alan's acceptance speech wasn't one of his best speeches because he likely spent more time thinking of how he would congratulate Robbins on his victory. Wes Robbins later went on to be a very prominent politician. It was often mentioned that he never lost an election in his long political career. It was technically right. He didn't lose an election, but he did lose a nomination in his own party, and that was to Alan Stevens. Alan served as the MLA for Rosetown from 1960 to 1964. He was one of only 37 MLAs who made up the government that introduced Medicare into Saskatchewan. It was possibly the most controversial and emotional issue in the history of the province. Although the government was defeated in the next election, and Alan was as well, Medicare was here to stay and eventually spread across the country. Regardless of one's political leanings, I think most agree that the introduction of Medicare was groundbreaking and was the right thing to do. It's a true success story that a farmer from Harris played a role in setting the course for health care in the province and in the country. Moving on from politics to farming. Farming has always been an important part of our family history. The Stevens farming story began when Granddad headed out west from his Ontario home in 1903 on his 18th birthday. He worked on farms for 2 years and then took out a quarter-section homestead on the land titled 183110 west of the 3rd. This is southeast of Paris, and that was in 1905. That land was later passed on to Les, and then on to Terry, who still owns it, and rents it to Rick and Kevin. Holly tells me she almost cries when she thinks of how hard Rick and Kevin work just to make the rent payments. Only to see Terry and Linda squander the money on their extravagant. Holly didn't really say that. So I just made that up. But she did say something about the rent could actually be considerably lower if they flew economy class into restaurants. Between 1905 and the early 1920s, the farm grew from one quarter section of 160 acres to over 1,000 acres, which was a very large operation. The average farm size at that time would have been less than 300 acres. In 1924, a group of Mennonite families bought both the adjoining 24 Wilson farm and Granddad's farm, with agreements calling for payments over a period of years. Unfortunately, the sales agreements didn't work out. Very few payments were made, and the Wilsons took their land back after a few years. Granddad had bought the farm Ken now owns north of Paris in the meantime, but then had little choice to take back the South farm in 1935. It was failing and the taxes weren't even being paid. Also, there was only about 80 acres of the 1,000 acres still being farmed. The rest was sitting idle and growing up to weeds. This was in the heart of the Depression when many families simply walked away from farms. Granddad's land dealings over the years enabled him to give even though I hear them tell it they never made any money and only did it to help feed the world. In many farm families at the time, the sons served more as hired men and old grandpa ran the show. That wasn't the case in the Stevens. By the late 1930s, the boys basically ran the day-to-day operations. There's been some question whether Granddad turned over operations to the boys, or they in effect took it over and systematically eased him into retirement. In any event, it worked. The farms prospered, and it remained in the family, even though some is now rented out. Interestingly, Kevin is the sixth generation Stevens to farm and afford land that was originally in our grandfather's name, William O. Stevens. That's a look at the farming side. Mita would likely think something was wrong if I didn't have a few comments about her. Our son mentioned a while back that Mita, as the last surviving member of the original Granddad Stevens family, could now be considered the patriarch of the family. My dictionary defines a patriarch as a senior person who exercises authority over an extended family or tribe. While she is clearly a senior person, I have a few questions and concerns about her exercising authority over all the rest of us. Although she has some good characteristics, she can also be so damn stubborn and set in her ways. That characteristic is totally foreign to most of us, I think. Someone once said that Mita was one of a kind. There was never a person like her before, and there will never be another. I think they had it right. She and Jack were a bit from the old school when it came to raising their family. Mita ruled with a wooden spoon. There were no wimpy timeouts, and she didn't take any guff from anyone. I'm sure she'll have something more to say about her famous wooden spoons. I've known those Doherty kids all their lives, and I don't blame Mita and Jack for being tough on them. If they'd been my kids, I would have been even tougher. But on the other hand, I suppose if I was their parent, they all would have run away from home. Seriously, Mita, you've always been a special person to all of us. I'm glad you could make it here today, and we look forward to hearing your comments in a few minutes. I want to end by sharing a little story I heard a while ago. There's a little bit of rough language involved, but I can't imagine many Stevens being offended by a bad word or two. As a matter of interest, swearing has been fairly common in our family, and it went from one extreme to the other. Granddad swore quite a bit. Irene never said a swear word in her life. Lauren had a few select words he often used, and Dick could work about 4 or 5 swear words all into one sentence. The story is about 2 farm boys who were nice guys but not too swift. They could have been named Brian and Gary, or Vaughn and Murray, or Doug and Ken, but for purposes of telling the story, we'll call them Gordon and Terry. They had a close friend named George, hung around with each other most of the time. They went everywhere together and they did everything together. Unfortunately, one day George's house burnt down, and they were quite sure he had died in the fire. A charred body was taken to the funeral home, and the undertaker called Gordon and Terry to come in and identify it as George. Gordon was first in, and he looked at the face and he said, "Oh, he's burnt pretty bad. I can't be sure, but turn him over." So the undertaker took the body over, and Gordon said, "No, I don't think that's George." And Terry was in next, and the same thing happened. He said he looked at the face and said, "I can't be sure," but turned him over and same thing, God, I just don't think that's George. Well, the undertaker was kind of confused by this. And so he asked the two how they could be determined it wasn't George simply by looking at the turned over body. Well, Gordon explained they were looking to see if the body had 2 arseholes. Or assholes, if you wish. The undertaker was even more confused and said that was just plain stupid. He says, nobody has two arseholes. But Gordon and Terry insisted that George must have had two, because when they and George were together, people would often say, there goes George with the two arseholes. Well, that's my look at the Stevens family. I hope I covered some of their history. I should mention that Rita and I don't plan to speak at the next family reunion. It'll likely be in another 25 years or so. By that time, I'll be 102 and Rita will be 113. So I think we'll live up to some of you younger folks. Thanks and have a good evening.